Namova to everyone and greetings. This is Abhivardhan from Global Law Assembly, and here we begin with Global Hint Season 3. I thank everybody for their support for the first two seasons of Global Hint. Uh, we have been discussing about the Indo Pacific for long, and the Indo Pacific will be at the heart of our discussions in international affairs and even international law. Now, in this third season of Global Hint, we will be discussing newer avenues of geopolitics and international relations as they turn out to be beyond the Quad, beyond the Afghanistan issue, and beyond, of course, the United States. Now we have, but unfortunately, we have United States again because we are now discussing the Ukraine-Russia crisis. So tonight, I have a very interesting panel. I would say a panel of academics and policy geeks. So we have Surya Kanegaonkar. He's a international relations and policy geek. You can follow him at Surya K on Twitter. He has written some really exceptional articles on IR issues related to Indian foreign policy and even the geopolitical constructs concerned with it. We also have Datesh Parulekar ji. Datesh ji is currently an assistant professor at the School of International and Area Studies at Goa University. We have Sudarshan Garg, who is a defense policy geek. You can follow his threads on Twitter with respect to defense related issues and even security aspects. And we have Rishabh Vats, who is a visiting professor at NMIMS Mumbai. He also is a policy geek and an IR geek, and you can also follow his tweets at his Twitter profile, and you can know more about his exceptional views on IR issues in India and abroad, of course. So to begin with, the reason I wish to have this discussion at the first place was because of because of a very interesting thread by Sudarshan, which was on Twitter regarding the Ukraine-Russia crisis and why is it that NATO. When we say NATO, we meant, of course, the United States and the European powers, the Atlantic plus transatlantic countries, and their responsibility, why they're responsible so much for the current ongoing issues which are happening between Russia and Ukraine. So, to give a basic context for this discussion, Sudarshan, it would be great if you would explain the viewers about this Ukraine-Russia crisis. Of course, it's a post-Soviet issue which we are seeing right now, and how has it emerged so far? Why and how much we should understand when it comes to the liability of, not, I would say, I would not use the word liability, I would say the responsibility of the Americans and the Europeans, because the international media discusses a lot about Vladimir Putin, but an honest discussion about the way Russia is being dealt by EU, NATO, and US is very less done. Although there are certain exceptional thinkers in the West doing it, but I think it's something for us as Indians also to realize that yes, it's an important matter of concern for the Indo-Pacific. So here you go. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Abhivardhan, and hello to all my fellow esteemed panelists. So just to set the context, I think Abhivardhan, the Twitter thread was very restricted. In fact, I mentioned that in the thread as well. That I mean, 256 characters or whatever only allows you to write so much. But actually, the roots of this conflict go back, I would say, to the 1750s and 1800s, and has been ongoing ever since. It's always been a sort of a tug of war, between the West on the one hand and Russia, before the Russian Empire, now later Soviet Russia, and then Russia on the other hand. So if you look at it broadly, though, from 1750 onwards till about 1907, 1910, Russia expanded at an exponential rate. Okay, I think the numbers are fantastic. We're looking at about 18,000 kilometers of square kilometers of territorial acquisitions every year for 200 years. That's massive. Now the problem is, as long as this kept away from the sphere of the Western powers, they were content and they were quite happy with that. It is when they started intruding into, say, the Balkans, or they started nibbling at the Ottomans, for example. That's when they started, the trouble started. And there's a lot of reason to why I'm mentioning this, because Britain went through Russophobia, similar to what we're seeing right now, between, say, 1850 to about 1910. And if you read the tabloid magazines from then, you look at the caricatures, you look at the pictures, it's very, very similar to what we are seeing, in today's world. So nothing is new. It's all the same. But coming specifically to the Ukraine, starting the 1920s and the rise of the Soviet power, it has been all about maintaining buffer states, right? If you look at the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it was about creating buffer states. It could be the Baltics, it could be Poland. It is about creating buffer states. The problem is Russia sees Ukraine as its own backyard, rightfully so or wrongfully so. I'm not getting into the ethics of this, but that's how it has been. The Ukraine has either been a part of Russian territory or it has been a satellite state. They've rarely had wars, and they've rarely had animosity between each other. And that's very important because the Ukraine is the breadbasket of that region, and Russia needs to secure that interest, right? But if you look at coming to the modern times, I'm sure we'll discuss a lot more. But in the modern times, the West, led by the US primarily, has intervened in the Ukraine twice. First were the Orange Revolutions, okay, and there were a lot of Western funding, a lot of Western media driven, say attention to creating first the environment for the Orange Revolution and then seeding it, and then it became organic. The Western media always calls it organic revolutions, but in a sense, they were not organic, they were seeded, right? And then later, during the 2013 Euromaidan revolutions, and that the Euromaidan revolutions were even more blatant because you had the US Under Secretary of State, as well as people like John McCain visiting the opposition parties. You had media houses like the NYT and Washington Post crying about how popular this is and how democratic it is, when it was not. There was a lot of Western US government backing, as well as civil society backing. Now, why is this relevant to today? Because the Kremlin does not appreciate this. The Kremlin wants the Ukraine, it wants the Baltics, it wants those to be the buffer state. Tomorrow is there going to be a war? We don't know. But that's been the cornerstone of Russian foreign policy. And whenever there's a pushback in the Ukraine or in those regions, you will have pushback from the Kremlin. So there's a lot of noise that is being missed. Or how many people know about the Euromaidan revolutions and the role that the US played in literally interfering and meddling with the sovereign affairs of another state, especially one that borders a great power. Russia is not going to take it lying down, right? So they have been pushing back. They have been using their own agents of influence to set up their own governments of power. It's just that it's just one side that is shown, and the other side is completely neglected. And centuries actually, this conflict and Russophobia.
To add up to this perspective, as we see uh, the whole history, I think Sudarshan has given a very interesting point that there are certain layers of interventionism, and they stem back to the history of the First World War and even the Second World War, and of course the Cold War era. Um, uh, I think there lies the whole point of seeing it much wisely. So now my question will be to Datesh sir to begin with, and then I think Surya and Rishabh can add add pointers. So Datesh ji, namaste. The question that I have is that yes, there's a chance that this escalation is seen in a way already to show as if that the United States, which we know that the Americans have this interest in interventionism, and interventionism itself drives their economics of conflict. Why would they invest in Afghanistan? Why would they go for war in Syria? Why would they do anything in Libya? Right? There is an economics involved in it. Now, when it comes to Vladimir Putin and Russia, of course, this the whole thing with charisma doesn't work that way lightly, because there are layers within the Russian hierarchy, within the Russian state, of course, and I think this is something which needs to be demystified, because of course, I am pretty sure, I might be wrong, I don't know, that at least the Indian state doesn't look that way. The Indian state doesn't look like the Americans in this case. That okay, fine, this is a question of priority. So how should we see it to start with, and how has been the course of interventionism so much? So I think on this point, I think you can respond, and then Rishabh and Surya can add up. So
Yeah, thank you. Am I audible? Yeah, thank you. So yeah, it's a very good question that you put forward, Abhivardhan. Let me just begin by situating today's proposition in what I call as a multi-layered, three-dimensional framework of security dilemmas. And I think when you look at the US, NATO, Russia issue, you have to look at it at three levels. The first level is the conceptual level of how do you look at each other ideologically. And here I pose the question, for the last 30 years that the Soviet Union dismembered and Russia became a successor state, has Europe and the United States seen Russia as a systemic threat, a systemic rival, or a systemic competitor? These are terminologies we today use in the context of the West relationship with China. But I think the same questions need to be asked with regard to how the West looks at Russia. Because in many ways, your frontiers can be frontiers of opportunity, they can also be frontiers of vulnerability. And here I would point out that over the last 3 decades, there has been a consistent recurring thread in American foreign policy, which is deeply hostile to Russia. Russia makes a good point when they say that successive administrations in various ways have looked at some ways in every which way to subvert Russia in its own periphery. You look at the Clinton administration, which was in power from 1983 to 2000, and it was staffed with people who looked at democracy as a liberal project. But at that time, the whole idea was to expand the democratic rim all around Russia by bringing in the Central and Eastern European states and also the former Soviet republics. So, in many ways, democracy was used as a project to undermine Russia and Russia's concerns on security. You then had the Bush administration that came in very agnostic about nation building. But after 9/11, they changed tack. And they, in fact, used the goodwill that President Putin provided to George W. Bush when Russia was seen as accepting American bases in Central Asia, American bases in other parts of Eurasia. And the Americans used that as a way in which they thought they will do nation building in many of the republics. And we all remember 2003, 2004, and 2005, when we had, of course, the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution, and the Tulip Revolutions. So all of these three, in a sense, entrench this view that no matter which American administration comes in, the policy remains very clear because the people who staff these administrations are Russian holdovers from the Cold War, and they continue to see Russia in that element of suspicion. Subsequently, you had the Obama administration, and there also we remember the kind of dysfunction in the relationship between Putin and the Clintons when Hillary Clinton was around as Secretary of State. And fourthly, the most important point being that over the last decade or so, the Americans have lost a lot of credibility. I believe a very important point for us to see this entire NATO, issue with Ukraine is actually what happened in Syria. Because if Obama had not balked with his own red lines in Syria, it would have sent a very different message to Russia. This is a very different Russia since 2011, when Obama called out his own red lines and then retreated from his own red lines, thereby allowing Putin to realize that the Americans have limits if they are pushed into their own den. So the issue of interventionism for the last 30 years is not a red herring. There is a lot of evidence to prove that the Americans, through NATO and even outside of NATO, have been trying to undermine Russia in its own periphery. And this periphery remains most important because for a country which is largely a land-based empire, former empire, it is going to always see its land-based periphery very differently to how it sees its maritime periphery. So I'll stop here for now on this point, and I'll come back to the other two security dilemmas as we move forward.
Yeah. One follow-up question to,
Yeah.
and of course, it's not to you, sir, for now, but it's to both Rishabh and Surya. So, if we look at, and I think you can add your points as Datish has said. Uh, when we look at the whole idea of value systems in that regard, and the legitimacy, and of course the whole course of interventionism, how do you both see it for the international community in general, and not just, of course, the Russians and India, but in general, what do you see? So I think Rishabh can now continue, and then Surya. Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Abhivardhan, for inviting me, and I'm very, glad to join you all. On the value system part, I think you're right that India has to be a little careful in this response from an Indian, and I'm talking from an Indian perspective here. I think as people or speakers have pointed out before me, that this was not, about values, but the American tend to, of course, mix the both very carefully when it comes to these situations. I mean, look at now, for example, right? I mean, the current President Zelensky, I mean, you can say he's a, upholder of democracy, etc. But the fact remains that many of the opposition leaders are in jail right now, right? So I don't think it's as straightforward as America would like it to be, of course. And they often, of course, make oversimplify this whole idea that this is just about Ukraine, as other Central European countries, has the right to, of course, choose as to who it would ally with, how or with whom should it geopolitically orient itself or align itself. But I think that would be an oversimplification. And I often, of course, see the comparison. You see Western commentators often comparing, saying that, well, the Baltic countries, have done this in the past, and that wasn't that a big of a problem. But I would, of course, point out that, I mean, I know we'll get to the NATO enlargement issue later on, but Ukraine and Belarus, for example, are not comparable to the Baltic states. They are historically and culturally very much linked to Russia in a way, in a very unique way, which, for example, Estonia or Latvia, Lithuania are not. And you have to see this, holistically. I mean, I would say that of course, the Western commentary or Western intelligence reports of a full-scale invasion, I think these are a little exaggerated and I think misleading. I would, I mean, I can only predict this, or I can. To me, I think it is not just about. I think Putin is smart enough to understand that any full-scale invasion of Europe, or sorry, Ukraine, would be very counterproductive, right? So I think, to me, of course, he's trying to test the waters. I mean, again, you have to remember uh, there is a French election coming up, right? There has been a change in leadership in Germany as well. You have the SPD party, who's not as I won't use the word aggressive, but it has a different Russian policy. Of course, you have the Greens in the coalition with the SPD, who are very hawkish on Russia. So there is a flux in European leadership as well. I mean, there are ongoing debates. I mean, since the Trump administration, there has been ongoing debates about, EU and NATO, and, how they should perceive or approach certain security challenges, not just vis-a-vis Russia, but also China, right? So I think this is Putin trying to test the waters. He's trying to reiterate the preeminence of Russia as not just a middle power, or a power of a bygone era, which some Americans still like to reiterate, which Obama, by the way, did. And he's trying to put a message across. And to be very honest, I understand the NATO enlargement issue, and I hope we'll come back to that later. But let's be honest here, it's not like Russia is, all these conditions that they have put in. It does not mean that even if we have a conversation and let's say America accepts some of these, I don't think Russia will immediately back off. So Russia, of course, has its own issues too, and again, we'll get into how legitimate these grievances are. But for me, that there has been too many changes in Europe, and I think what Putin is basically trying to do here uh, is to at least put forth a request, or not a request, but a proposal of a wholesale review of the European security architecture. Of course, it's not. I mean, I'm sure Russians are smart enough to understand that it's not going to be that easy, right? But I think it's the timing of it is very crucial. I mean, look at what Biden. I mean, for example, I mean, I'm not saying Biden's weak. I mean, a lot of people say that he's doing that because Biden's a pushover. I don't think so. I think he's doing it because he knows, for example, that for America, this is a very crucial time, right? Of how the world views it. after the Afghanistan debacle, I don't think Biden presidency will be able to, especially with the midterms coming up. So it's going to be a huge challenge for them domestically as well, right? So I think this is just Putin trying to, you know, put feelers out there to see the reactions, to test the European leadership and the the Atlantist coordination, etc. And on the value system part, again, I would reiterate, I don't think that is as important as the West makes it out to be. And that is, I think, something that we should, I mean, it's an important debate to have, to be very honest with you, but I think it's very inconsequential in the current context. Thank you.
Yes, Surya, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for hosting this, Abhivardhan. I think it's a very important discussion to have at this moment in time, considering there are a confluence of factors that I see, which I think Rishabh also really discussed to an extent, and which are kind of forming together at this very critical juncture, which kind of gives President Putin, I believe, a sense of confidence that he can achieve his objectives at this moment in time. One is obviously the departure of the United States from Afghanistan, the sort of the concerns that many American allies may have around America's leadership, when whether it's in Europe, to defend America's interests, or even European interests, really within Europe, or even in East Asia for that matter. We have seen a coming together of Russia and China to some extent, on actually on several issues. And we're seeing messaging from Beijing and Moscow to some extent being coordinated, or at least they come across as being coordinated. There's pressure on the US through Taiwan, and there's pressure on the US through Ukraine. And the extent to which a Biden administration will be able to reverse its fortunes from Afghanistan and be able to combat these emerging threats, I think that in both Beijing and Moscow are kind of calculating that, look, they don't have that risk-taking capability at the moment. So there's another aspect, which is the energy aspect, which is the energy transition that we see in Europe, which actually has given Russia a bit of leverage, and that's an area that I'm very familiar with, being in the energy trading space myself. Over the last last decade or so, there have been nuclear phase outs, there have been coal phase outs, and what this has done is it has reduced the flexibility within the European energy system, to the point that it is largely dependent on renewables and gas, less dependent on nuclear, because Germany phased out, went through its nuclear phase out, and coal obviously because of the pollution curbing plan that they have. So essentially, Europe is more dependent on Russian gas than ever before. And this is also coming at a time when the geopolitical calculus is such that that President Putin feels that he can take these, can actually make a move. And I think that we also need to look at his moves right now within the context of history. I think this has also been discussed by the other panelists, but I think that we need to see that Putin, in many ways, looks at the breakup of the Soviet Union as something that needs to be fixed, and needs to, when he looks at Ukraine being within the American sphere of influence, the converse would be essentially having Mexico within the Warsaw Pact, right? Had that been still alive, right? I mean, that it's not a very comfortable space for Russia to be in, to have the Americans at their doorstep, and this is an opportune time to push them back. I think President Biden, in many ways, has kind of ruled out putting troops on the ground if Putin actually goes into to Ukraine and gets into the Donbass region. So I think that the cards are really with Russia at the moment, and Xi Jinping, on the other hand, can push on Taiwan. He can push in many other spheres. So when these two countries come together to push the United States into a corner, they can potentially be quite successful, especially when both of these leaders have very long-term outlooks and can weather storms for much longer periods of time than the U.S. administration really can. And I just wanted to make these few points, but I can go into more details on some of the economic issues a bit later, if we have time for that.
Abhiwardhan, just a quick point on the whole value-based system because those are optics. I think I should remind our viewers that U.S. Cooperation with China intensified after Tiananmen. You look at their FDI charts, you look at the level of cultural exchanges. It really took off after Tiananmen. I mean, I'm not saying that's the catalyst. The point is, it really had no bearing on the U.S. because the U.S. was looking at China as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. That's pretty much it. It's all about realpolitik. I mean, if you look at the French, for example, they have done a lot to destabilize the Western African region. I mean, they've been involved directly or indirectly in the assassinations of multiples, like we're talking about 6 to 8 national leaders. But when it comes to optics, it's the Western powers are always about a rules-based order, about democracy. The point is, it's all about realpolitik. And Putin is doing what the West has been doing to him. Because don't forget, in '96, he was on the losing side of an election that Bill Clinton rigged for Boris Yeltsin. So he's seen that, upfront, and close and personal. And I don't think the Russians are going to let that happen again.
Just a quick point to
That's
add to what you were saying,
sure.
if that's okay. In fact, Putin's approach is very traditionalist, pan-Slavic, revivalist, Eastern Orthodoxy sort of approach to consolidating power in Russia and its periphery, and what it sees as a natural area of its influence, just like how the US has its area of influence. Now, the point on values, I think it's becoming more and more apparent that the US has been using its it has been imposing its value structures on countries, and in ways that has actually been detrimental to those countries' growth trajectories, and has in fact been detrimental to their security as well. We have seen the export of democracy to the Middle East, which has not really worked out the way that it should have. We've seen wars actually being fought by the US in the Middle East, which actually did not see any end until the Russians really came in a bit later with a very different set um, uh, of measures and coercive or measures in some cases, which perhaps the US was not able to implement, and which created greater stability on the ground. So Putin was able to do what Obama was not able to do. Rather, in fact, Obama created, in some sense, the vacuum that from which ISIS emerged, and then Russia kind of stepped in and was able to kind of go in and blunt that to a large extent. So, which side really do these esoteric values actually help? I mean, it helps the United States further its hegemony, and Putin is aware of that. We see we see China actually talk about this in pretty much every single forum. They go out there and they say that the days of American hegemony is over, that they're over, and the democracy is not something that America has exclusive control over across the world, and they have no right to even talk. In fact, the Chinese actually came up with a very ludicrous statement saying that their own country has democracy, a more valuable form of democracy than the United States. So it's a multi-pronged attack on the United States to say that this is kind of, and as we also talk about many times on Twitter and beyond, about what that means for India. Right? I mean, we know that the American form of democracy, they try and export it to India. It's not necessarily what we want, and it's not necessarily in our interest, and we push back on it. So I just wanted to make this quick point.
Great. So, I think since we have to discuss about the Americans and the Europeans and their role in this whole, um, a concern which I would raise is that because of whatever is happening between the Americans and I would say the NATO countries plus, I would say NATO and Europeans countries plus with Russia, we somehow ignore what really is happening in Ukraine, in a sense that, is it really going to help Ukraine? Is it really going to, because there could be a chance that Russia might say, okay, we just want Ukraine to be Ukraine, let Ukraine not join NATO, as their condition is, of course, that. And at the same time, since Surya very rightly mentioned about the whole politics which is happening in Europe regarding energy, which is nuclear energy and so on, uh, how will it affect the EU in general? Because uh, of course the EU has its own share of rhetoric against the Russians, and of course it tries to do against the Chinese also. That's a different question altogether. And after this we can get on India right away. But let us come to a larger aspect of impact for Ukraine, for European Union in general. And the US is another actor, but I'm not much interested in obsessing upon that. Uh, so the question is to Surya. How do you see the role of the EU, and is it really something which shows the whole crisis that because of whatever has happened between Russia and the West, as we call it, the EU and Ukraine would be positively or negatively, howsoever, be affected? And then I think that Tejji can add up, and then Rishabh, and then of course Sudarshan. So yeah, please.
I think that when we look at Europe, we see that there are many. Obviously, it's there's a union, but then each country has its own interests which they would like to push, as it's not a cohesive bloc entirely. Both Russia and China would like to see um, a factionalized Europe. And it is in their interest. And the Chinese, we have seen kind of work with select governments and select leaders, extending their BRI in some parts of Europe, and working with certain business groups and corporates to entrench themselves and exert influence, at which could end up being at the expense of the interest of the European Union as a whole, when they want to actually, when these countries need to come together to fight a more existential threat, these special interest groups may work against a cohesive plan of the EU. So I think this is something which we're seeing the beginning of in some ways, as different countries are kind of having their own views at this point in time. Um, uh, in Germany, we have this issue of obviously Nord Stream 2. I think they're okay with Nord Stream 2 not coming online right now, at least for the next 1 year. The global markets have essentially priced this, financial markets. What does this essentially do for Russia? Russia has got to a point where they can their energy prices are exceptionally high. Gas prices are through the roof. We're seeing, all-time high prices for electricity. This is going to strain the budgets of European countries. Each country will start looking out for their own self-interest as they manage their own budgets to see, okay, how do we access cheaper energy? We can't have gas prices at these levels. So who will push Brussels to kind of get Germany to get the Nord Stream 2 approved? Will that actually show that economics plays a greater significance within the European mindset than wider geostrategy? Or will America influence Europe much more and be able to hold off this Nord Stream 2 coming online for indefinitely, and essentially the Europeans take this cost of higher energy prices, higher electricity prices, which may in fact filter into their monetary policy, their interest rate policy, because they can't possibly keep subsidizing forever if energy prices remain high. So all it's just a lot of conflicting interests will start emerging as energy prices remain high, as this conflict persists between Ukraine and Russia, rather than the West and Russia. So this you would think that a quick finish is the best solution for President Putin. It may not necessarily be the case.
Yes, Taddeshi, please go ahead.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting phase where we have reached, because I wanted to comment on a few things here. The first is when we look at Europe. I mean, we were just talking about the motivations for Russia and why is it doing what it's doing, right now with Ukraine. And we discuss a lot of things, including China and the US. But one of the things is also to test the resolve and the cohesion of the transatlantic partnership. Because what Moscow has seen in the last few months, in fact, across administrations, is that there has been a fraying of the transatlantic partnership, no less because of AUKUS, which of course has in fact put the Europeans on a very different course, where Europe is now talking about greater intensification of their own defense autonomy. And Russia definitely believes that no matter what happens, you can change history, but you can't change geography. And Europe's geography is intertwined with that of Russia. So no matter what happens, even if the Americans were to mount the high horse and take a very strong position against Russia, it'll be the Europeans who will be pushing for some kind of a modus vivendi or a kind of a via media, because that's the only way the Europeans can keep stability in terms of the continent. Also, very importantly, Russia also recognizes that they've made strategic inroads in different parts of Europe. I mean, they do have outliers today within Europe who can scuttle any kind of decision making within Europe. And given Europe's, the EU's ability for a process of what is called as silent consensus, it actually means tyranny of the minority, where one country can essentially hold up decision making within the EU. And just as China does that within ASEAN through the likes of Cambodia, where they try and go and kill consensus within ASEAN, the Russians can very well go and kill that through maybe a Viktor Orban in Hungary or through maybe the Czech Republic, etc., etc. So that's another point. The third important point is the Russians are looking essentially at trying to pressurize Europe, because they're looking to see how far Europe is going to remain united on the whole issue of energy. In fact, on the energy issue, this is something which the Russians have been able to play a very smart game, because always it has been accepted that the fundamental pillar of EU project has been the German and the French partnership. That French and German partnership has come unstuck, at least in terms of rhetoric, where France has openly criticized Germany for going its own way on Nord Stream 2. And these two countries are going to be critical no matter what happens now or 10 years later within the EU. So the Russians are trying to see how they can keep both these countries necessarily off kilter from one another, keep them a little bit off balance, so that Europe is constantly preoccupied by its own domestic concerns and therefore is never in a position to be able to mount a kind of a cohesive strategy or a cohesive posture against Russia with regard to the periphery states. But an important point I want to draw up here, if you look at the recent proposals which Russia has given, of course, some of them are non-starters. For example, asking for security guarantees which are treaty-based are as much of a non-starter as what Pyongyang asked from Washington in terms of a no aggression pact, if you want me to negotiate. But the point is, this time the Russians have included the Central Asian states also. They're not talking only about the Baltics or the Black Sea states, or for that matter, the Caucasus. They're saying we want treaty guarantees from the European Union and from NATO that they will not extend their tentacles even into Central Asia. And I think this brings into a very interesting proposition, which we must also look at. How does Russia look at its peripheries? I mean, Russia has three peripheries. One, of course, is its land-based periphery that heads into Europe. The other is its Central Asian underbelly that basically heads into the Indian Ocean. And its third is, of course, its Russian Far East. And if you look at all these three peripheries, there are very interesting approaches that Russia takes. When it comes to its Eurasian or its land-based periphery, it's about power projection and power assertion in that periphery. When it comes to its Russian Far East, it's looking to basically fine-tune its dependence on China by diversifying and bringing other countries into the mix, so that China's role in its Russian Far East periphery is kept, China's role in its Far East periphery is kept at bay. And when it comes to Central Asia, they seem to want to give Central Asia that centrality. And that's why they seem to be aligning more with India on a Central Asian centrality, so as to be able to maintain the prominence of Russia. So in all these three, they look at the Europeans and the EU as some degree of a potential partner, but also somebody that needs to be kept off balance so that they can actually keep asserting power on their own terms within the Eurasian periphery. Thank you.
I think Rishabh, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting point by Datesh. Again, I think the whole idea about the maritime perception of threat is also very important. One also has to remember that in the Black Sea, just June this year, there were certain, I mean, Russia fired a warning shot. So there have been, certain tensions going around even in the Black Sea, for example. And I think as recently as October or November, we saw the Sixth Fleet of the United States, and they dispatched its flagship vessel. So Russia also sees that, for example, these kind of actions as provocations, and of course, as Sir pointed out, this we also have to be very mindful of, or at least see from this situation as to how Russia is beginning to see its neighborhood. And I think that is going to be very important, not just vis-a-vis Europe, but also vis-a-vis China. And I think that is also going to be important for a country, especially like India, and how we navigate, these kind of relationships. For example, a lot of people have talked about, Russia, or at least proposed the idea that Russia can be a mediator between India and China. I mean, of course, it's not as simple as it sounds, and some people do oversimplify it. But I think it's important because for us, this is going to be. I mean, although it's a distinct episode, I think it also shows how Russia probably is trying to reorient itself, or probably trying to redefine how it sees its security, periphery. And one thing I think, again, I think previous speakers did point out, especially with regards to energy security. I think apart from just putting the demands out there, right? Apart from just trying to test the waters, etc., or trying to test the resolve of the United States or the transatlantic relationships, I think they're also looking for concessions. And I think Putin, according to me at least, one thing which he already has got what he wanted, was actually a one-on-one meeting with Biden, right? The optics of that, I think, is very important for somebody like Vladimir Putin. And I'm not just saying this, putting this point across as Americans do often do, that, oh, this is something, he's a 19th century figure and he's trying to play to the home gallery, and this is for this domestic consumption. I'm not making that point. I'm essentially saying that at times Vladimir Putin and Russia as a whole, uh, time to time they have to kind of put their foot down to reassert themselves that, hey, we're here, right? Put themselves at an equal footing with the United States, and saying that you have to be sensitive to our concerns. So when I talk about, for example, like a wholesale review, as Sir pointed out before, some of the demands are, of course, very absurd. But I would say that it also comes from, I think they're also trying to put these feelers out there because of the American rhetoric, right? You see, for example, since Afghanistan, they have talked about how Biden is now, the president with a realist inclination, right? There's a lot of talk about reorientation, right? There's a lot of talk about prioritization and reallocation of, or redeployment of resources and troops, which will challenge or cater to 21st century needs, basically China, right? So when they were, for example, withdrawing from Afghanistan, there was a lot of talk about, oh, we are not, running away. This is, a very prudent call. We don't have to waste resources. And again, that was a good point. But you see that Biden administration is trying to send this message across, that this is an administration which is taking stock of how foreign policy has been done in this country for a very long time. And I think, and again, I'm not saying that this is something, there's something something will come out of it, right? I mean, this does not mean that Moscow is only interested in a grand bargain of sort, or the fact that it's even possible. But I would say that I think he's trying to, or Russia is trying to play to these inclinations, not because, again, they consider Biden to be weak, but I think they think the timing is right, right? Because domestically, I think Biden, and I would agree with some Americans here, I think Biden is in a better position to do so. I think since Bush Senior, I don't think any precedent has had the opportunity or power or domestic constraints. For example, Trump tried to do some of that, and you know how it was, right? And again, this is something which was down to the Democrats, and somebody was talking about Russophobia, etc. So many precedents before Biden have been constrained on that front. And I'm not saying Biden will not face any challenges. For example, I mean, people have already started calling appeasement, even at the hint of a possible summit of sorts where these kind of Russia's offers will be, entertained. But I would say that he's already Putin, for example, has already got what he wanted. I think it a little bit. Somebody was mentioning, I think Nord Stream. Again, I would say that this is also something that they want. Get more concessions out of Europe. We see, for example, in the last few months, European energy crisis. It's not the same for all countries, by the way. France is in a much better place than compared to Germany, for example. Germany is more reliant on Russian gas, right? So one point is that as well, and of course the last point is, which I think will create a good segue for us to probably talk about, uh, that they're trying to draw red lines, right? I mean, as much as Americans would like to say that these are not legitimate grievances, you have to remember that 14 countries have joined as members in NATO since German unification, and that's not something which you can outrightly dismiss. Uh, and again, I see, for example, and a lot of other scholars have talked about it. There is a pattern in these kind of situations. I mean, you see, for example, 2004 there was a second NATO enlargement, right? I mean, NATO enlargement basically came in two waves, main two waves, and you see, for example, 2004 Russian interference in Ukrainian election was heightened, right? You see, for example, 2008 in Bucharest summit, you see George Bush, etc., being very nonchalant about U.S. Russian concerns and talking about a possible, enlargement of NATO with Ukraine and Georgia, right? And then, for example, you see the 2008 Russian-Georgian conflict. Again, this is a very important point. I don't think this is just about NATO enlargement. A lot of other scholars have pointed out that it's also economic integration. No matter how much the United States or other European countries assure Russia that, okay, fine, you know what, we're not going to enlarge or we're not going to offer Ukraine a NATO membership, it doesn't even qualify, etc., etc. But the point remains that they don't even deny it that openly. I think last Saturday, State Department spokesperson actually said that we haven't, he very vague, basically dismissal of, whether Ukraine would be offered a membership or not. He basically said that there is an open door policy which NATO has always followed, and it will keep continuing to do so. And again, that is for me a very open-ended answer. So even if you look at outside of NATO, 2013-14, we saw something called as an association agreement, right? Which basically was a kind of an economic alignment with the EU. And that's what prompted, remember, I mean, most of your panelists and audiences will remember that this whole Maidan revolution and what happened in 2014, it all started from the then president actually saying no to an EU agreement, and that the protests etc. followed after that. So, in whole, I would say that, and perhaps we can talk about NATO enlargement or even possibly India or China. I think one thing that we have to be careful about is to understand, of course, that Russia has valid concerns, but it is to, I think what people tend to forget, that America also has a choice, right? And I don't understand why America or American scholars, experts, portray as if it doesn't have a choice when it comes to these countries. There can be a dialogue, right? At least there can be initiation of something of a dialogue, if not a grand summit of sorts where grand bargains will be struck. So there can be an initiation of a dialogue which can, there can be basic discussions about these things, no commitments of or etc. So I think Americans have to be a little bit more open about that. And here I would say is something which they've created a monster for themselves. Now the Democrats, for example, cannot be seen as to be weak on Russia because they have been so hard on every other administration that has preceded them, and this actually ties their hands much more than they would actually like it to be. And I think Biden as well, I mean, you see, it's actually too entangled. I mean, Russia is a very important part of their domestic politics, and actually I think that's a weakness in and handicap for American and how they deal with Russia. But again, I would say that it would be very pragmatic on their front if at least they could talk about it, right? So yeah.
Yeah. So of course, Sudarshan will give his perspective, but I think Sudarshan maybe can try to answer, or if any of the panelists can, because we have two questions from one person. So let's do that fast, and then of course Sudarshan can give his inclusive perspective, leading to which we'll discuss about India's priorities. So Jaravasya Arya asks, so here is the question to you, Sudarshan. My question is equal to Latinization of Ukrainian language instead of sticking to Cyrillic is the consequence of so I think it is a question but made in may be some issues,
It's a
but so he's trying to
fairly
say whether, yeah,
it's a fairly okay. I think one thing, I'm not going to address this directly, but I think one thing we need to keep in mind is there are two Ukraines. Okay, the west part of Ukraine has
mm,
always been pro, Europe, pro Europe engagement, pro Europe alignment, right?
right,
And then you have the eastern part, and this is not again now. We go back to history,
right,
and that's how it's always been structured. You
mm,
have the eastern part of Ukraine, which also has the majority of the 8 to 10 million Russian immigrants who form a big part of the economy in Ukraine. They are entirely, say, pro-Cyrillic. They're Orthodox, and they're very pro Moscow, to put it that way. So there is a conflict of cultures or clash of civilizations within Ukraine. It's not like there is one Ukrainian, ideology or thought that says, okay, let's go with the EU, let's join the NATO, or let's go with Moscow. In fact, in 96, 97, when the NATO first made the approach to Ukraine, only one third of Ukrainians, I still remember this, study or a survey, only one third of Ukrainians actually supported that. And my guess is if you broke it up into geographies, the majority of that one third would have come from the western part of Ukraine. So yes, there's a conflict within Ukraine wherein there's a group that wants to get out of the Russian ambit, and there is one that wants to stay within the Russian ambit. So this language, clash or language culture, it might also emerge from that. To be very honest, though, languages are not my forte, so that's. I mean, I'm not in a position to give a direct answer, but that's not my area of study. But yes, there is this constant struggle between the western and the eastern halves.
yeah. And I think the second question by Jaravasi R has also been answered, because the question was related to this only: why Central European nations, including Poland, want to quit the EU, or are trying to quit the EU, or are actually at least pondering upon it. I don't think they want to quit the EU right now, but let's say they assume. But why Ukraine and Georgia do? So I think, yeah. So I think if you wish to add some more perspective to it, then you
Yeah,
can do.
couple of points. In
Yeah.
fact, majority has been already covered. But yes, I think one point Rishabh raised, and I think I was going to raise it any which ways, is Russian actions again. But okay, I think one thing I need to make very clear, Abhi, I am not supporting Putin or anybody. I mean, every regime has its own pluses and minuses. Let me be very very honest. There are human rights violations, there are suppression of freedoms, but then I mean I could say the same for many Western countries. So that disclaimer done. Russian reactions they've always been reactions. Okay, if you look at it from 1991, when Glasnost and Perestroika brought down the Russian Empire, till about 96, Russia was too weak. Right, 96 was when the Americans intervened in the elections substantially, and that triggered the response a domestic response that ultimately saw Putin gain power. So that is an action/reaction, right? Similarly, if you look at it, so 2013, the president chose to accept, like Rishabh said, a Russian bailout plan, and he refused to go with with an EU bailout plan, and again that triggered Euromaidan, and that in turn triggered the Crimean annexation. So essentially, you can't look at it in isolation. There's always been action reaction, and it's a continuous cycle. But I think your question more was from the EU perspective, right? So if you look at the EU, short term, they're caught in a very bad place, because one, you have rising energy prices, you have COVID, winter that's coming up, and and a large part of, say, German natural gas supplies are driven from Russia, whereas Britain is more isolated, which is why Boris Johnson is being far more aggressive against this Russian aggression in Ukraine than, say, Germany, because Germany has to be placatory. I mean, otherwise their citizens are going to want for things like basic warmth. right? So I think that is also, you can't look at EU as a bloc per se, but I think Trump did a lot of damage in attempting to decouple the US, from NATO. That I would say gave Kremlin an opening because they figured that there are weaknesses, there are fissures, right? And I think now is a good time they've struck with rising oil prices to sort of extract bargains, right? I mean, and what could I mean, as far as I see it, as far as Russian foreign policy goals go, over the past 30, 40 years, even a withdrawal of of the Western alliance from the Ukraine will suffice, in the sense they do not basically want them meddling in their backyard. I think Surya said that it's like Russia setting up a client state in Mexico. I mean, the US is definitely not going to take it, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis started because why? Because Khrushchev decided to plant missiles in Cuba, which the US vehemently opposed because it's their own backyard. So they want concessions, and they know the next 3 to 4 months the time is right. So might as well squeeze out whatever concessions they can get, the optics, and then but I don't think Russia is in any state where they can afford a full scale war. I think that's just rumor mongering and war mongering by the Western media.
Great. So let us now come to India directly. There are a few questions coming on the chat which are related to it. As in the beginning, we had discussed about interventionism. Now, of course, people say, and as Suya gave the example of, I don't know what, uh, Warsaw Pact in Mexico. I think he referred that example. I think I would take it in rhetoric. So, uh, we all know that interventionism for the Americans has been costly, and it is something which will not work. Now, my estimation is, and I'm only giving because the question is related to it, and I think Surya can begin with it, is that due to the whole economics and the whole domestic impact, which is I'm referring to the United States right now, of regime change as people call it. Of course, since a sort of domestic stability is needed for main powers, even middle powers like India, and we are now coming on India. The question which I have is, how should India see the whole scenario? Because Central and Eastern Europe matters a lot for India, not just because Eastern Europe is near Turkey or the whole Mediterranean issue with Greece and Cyprus, but I'm saying from a larger perspective to understand, because in Central Asia, India has certain stakes. India has a role to play. I connect it in that way simply here because, not to exaggerate, but to make a point as to that, um India will be an important power to take into consideration for these uh, ongoing crisis. I mean, if anything happens in the Nagorno-Karabakh region again, for example, I'm just taking a hypothesis, or if anything happens worse than what happened in Afghanistan, near Central Asia, anywhere, then of course India might have certain specific concerns. Of course, does it affect us in domestic affairs or not? It's a completely different question. I mean, whatever happens in Ukraine will not directly affect us domestically, of course, but uh, I think for Indian diplomats and in the Indian state, I think that's a larger question as to how decision making should be done and how it should be pursued from a diplomatic angle. So I think here I would request Surya to give his pointers on the whole, I would say, decline of the regime change economics, and of course, how should India see it comprehensively, and then of course the Tejji, then Rishabh, and then Sudarshan. Yeah.
Sure. I think that when, as you said, it's not going to be directly relevant to India what exactly happens in Ukraine, and I mean, it'll happen through many different relationships internationally, which will end up affecting us. But I do think that there are some learnings that we must take away directly, at least from the surface. We should know that one of the issues that Russia and Putin specifically has had with the United States is that there were a bunch of Harvard-trained economists who landed in Moscow and post the um, breakup of the Soviet Union, who really pushed for privatization of assets and did this ahead of the of a strengthening of basic institutions, law and order machinery, and basic bureaucracy in the country. What this actually ended up leading to was a point where there was crony capitalism, state assets were stripped and were pretty much given to private oligarchs, people who ended up becoming oligarchs later on down the line. And this is something that actually Putin has clearly been against. He thinks that the U.S. had actively worked to sabotage Russia post the breakup of the Soviet Union. And he's trying to make amends in some ways geopolitically, trying to fix the economy in the way that he thinks it needs to be fixed. Not going down the route of a natural resource curse, which many countries end up facing. Natural resource rich countries end up facing. He's leveraging his position and within the natural resources space, because he knows that it works this way. You have your upstream of your natural resources, your midstream of your production of goods based, which require those natural resources either as energy or as inputs. And then you have those goods which end up going out to the public, to the consumers across the world, who are basically your downstream users. Now, if you control, essentially, you have multiple downstream users in democratic countries of goods, and you have very few upstream controllers, Russia being one of them. So essentially, even if you have a GDP asymmetry between one country and another, you can end up exercising inordinate amounts of control over the world by controlling your natural resources flow. Right? Saudi Arabia has kind of done that to some extent, but the U.S. went in and has kind of, to some extent, managed that relationship with Saudi Arabia at the expense of even human rights or whatever it may have been. Russia, on the other hand, decided to take a very independent approach, was not willing to be co-opted by any country. And I think that India has a lot of learnings from this. I talked a lot about this, but I wanted to talk specifically about what India must learn. They must realize that energy security is paramount. Even if it's you have to entrench yourselves with countries where, for example, with Russia. I think increasing an energy relationship with Russia is probably works in India's favor, as much as it is having a strong defense relationship, because Moscow works with both Beijing and New Delhi. So working with Russia to secure your natural gas, secure your oil, knowing that these are not going to be turned off at any point in time, because it is in Russia's interest to hedge its bets constantly. Even if that sort of relationship with China continues to develop, it knows that it's not going to put all its eggs in one basket. Just like how on the Western front, it realizes that it needs to consolidate power and use energy to kind of be a part of its political toolkit. On the Eastern side, India has to realize that it needs to leverage its position as a consumer, one of the largest consumers of energy. That's a very pivotal role. China is playing that role with Russia. India can play that role to say that, look, we are a sink for oil, we're a sink for gas, we are going to drive growth in energy and metals usage in the future. So we should leverage this position and be able to extract geostrategic value wherever we want in the world, whether it's in Central Asia or Europe or in Russia, or between Russia's relationship with China, however we want. We need to leverage our position a lot more. We can learn from Russia in this particular case, I think. So I think that's one of the main points, because it's my area of focus primarily on energy. So I wanted to speak about that and how India can kind of pick up some of the lessons from what we're seeing right now.
Yes, Sateshji, please.
Yeah, so I'll take this question in 3 or 4 ways. I mean, let's look at what India really has objectives in that particular region. The first objective that India would have is obviously economic. And I would still say that economically, with 50% of our export to GDP moving to our east, the Indo-Pacific and obviously Act East is going to remain a predominant anchor of India in terms of its economic standing. And in no way is this part of the world really going to be able to match up to that level of economic potential. So in that sense, India doesn't have that much of an incentive in equal terms. Let's look at connectivity. For our connectivity to Europe and through Eurasia, we are now almost singularly dependent on Moscow. With what's happened in Afghanistan, the single trick pony for us now is the international north-south transport corridor. And without having the total concurrence and the countenance of Moscow, that project is not going to go ahead. So we clearly understand that our connectivity into Europe through Eurasia is going to be dependent on Russia. And so to that extent, any indulgence with Ukraine or on the Ukrainian side is only going to endanger that part. The third issue is the issue of socialization. And this is important because the Modi government, which has had this mantra of no country left behind, has wanted to engage every part of Europe, and they have made conscious diplomatic attempts in that regard. You see the Nordic Baltic 8, which have been engaged very aggressively by the Modi government. We've seen even the dialogue with what is called as the Visegrad 4, which has been going on also in a very strong way. And this government has also reached out to that part of Europe, which probably was forgotten by us for decades, which is the Balkans. So, in that sense, we have got ourselves involved in a socializing manner with that part of Europe that is on the periphery with Russia. But at the same time, we also must remember that next year, when Spain takes over the presidency of NATO, NATO is coming out with a strategic concept document. And in that strategic concept document, they are looking to possibly shape an Indo-Pacific policy for the first time, which would go very well with their out-of-sphere operations doctrine that they brought in after the end of the Cold War, which allowed them to go into Afghanistan and also go into the Balkans. Now, India has made it very clear to NATO that it is not going to have anything to do institutionally with NATO, particularly intelligence cooperation. Because the moment India even touches NATO with a barge pole, there is going to be absolutely punitive consequences coming from Moscow. So as far as India is concerned, this region, whether it's the relationship with NATO or the relationship with Ukraine, is not really going to be something where India has very big equities. And so India is going to have to get involved at the expense of risking its relationship with Russia. Also, let's keep in mind, we are now hearing reports that just recently Moscow and New Delhi have shared what is called as a non-paper, what they're calling as a kind of informal consensus over objectives in Central Asia. This non-paper, which seems to have been shared between Moscow and Delhi, is looking very interestingly at third country defense production, where Russia would produce, under the Make in India scheme, Russia would produce defense hardware in India, and this would then be, transported or rather exported to third countries. Now, this is important because for a long time, India has refused to take a position in the Ukraine-Russia ding-dong, because while we depend on Russia big time for our platforms, we have also depended on Ukraine in terms of some of our sensitive technology, in terms of engines for our naval platforms. And so we have tried to kind of stay out of this issue for a long time. If we are now getting into a relationship with Russia, which gets us to export to third countries in terms of defense production and defense hardware, obviously the utility of Ukraine in the current context is going to reduce even more. So I don't see India, really a risk-averse India that India normally is, actually getting into this part of the world. But there is one concern that makes India reach out to this part of the world, which is the rising stock of Turkey. And I think we have not talked enough about it in today's session. And I think this is something that we must not leave out, because Turkey is really this regional power who is now breaking out of some of the shackles that it was kind of finding itself in. For example, now it's almost breaking its shackles out of NATO. It's beginning to pressurize the periphery, just like Russia, pressurizes the periphery with the EU. Turkey is also beginning to pressurize the periphery of the EU. And Turkey's supply of drones to Ukraine, which is and also supply of drones to Azerbaijan within the Nagorno-Karabakh crisis, which of course Putin called provocative, is something that now gets India very worked up. So India's engagement in this region is also to see that Turkey is kept somewhat hemmed into its region, because India remains increasingly concerned about what Turkey is doing in our own backyard or in our own neighborhood. So I would see that relationship more in that sense, rather than in terms of any major Indian initiative to this part of the world.
Just a very quick point to what you were saying, sir. I think that Turkey is a very good example of a country which is actually learning from Pakistan. They have learned how to extract from the United States and be able to push where it likes to push and still achieve its strategic objectives, at least to a large extent. It could devalue its currency to such a point and still almost get a. I mean, this the intervention by the bank was essentially a U.S. intervention that came in. They're never going to let a NATO state sink, and this actually throws up a bunch of interesting. Um, Equations, because how much can Ankara actually go out and extract value from both Moscow and Washington now? And I guess this is kind of a part of their game. So let's see.
Right.
Yes, Rishabh, you can go ahead. Yeah. Okay, I think there's some network problem. Rishabh, can you hear us? Yeah. Okay. It
Yeah,
seems
can
like
you hear
you.
me? Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah,
Yeah, sorry, some network issue.
no problem.
Yeah, so I think Datesh actually touched upon a few things already on the India part. One thing again, I would just like to reiterate. Others have probably made this point, but in a different way. I think there might be certain, if for example there is a Russian full-scale invasion, which I don't think is likely, but in case there is some sort of a military action or some sort of low intensity conflict, I think there are going to be certain questions asked of India, especially from the Western side, whether I mean, as to take a stand, let's say, I think again it would be very prudent, and I think the Ministry of External Affairs, especially under this government, I think they would like to kind of keep their hands off. Don't try to, so to say, take a side. I think in general, this government has been pragmatic in the way in which it deals with Russia, and I think the Russian relationship, despite certain challenges, has been dealt with in a very good way, especially considering what we've been doing with the United States. And I would say that in the end, if things do escalate, nobody wins, and I think there are high costs for Russia as well, and I think Russia understands that pretty much. I mean, militarily as well. If you look at it, it will be very bloody, right? I mean, you could in Donbass, for example, yes, they have made certain inroads, but pushing them, further will also be, there will be loss of for the Russians as well. And economically, it will be very devastating because, further sanctions. I mean, I think on that front, if there is an invasion, I think the Biden administration will stand its ground and put additional sanctions, which will actually hurt the Russian economy, which is not in that great of shape. But one thing again, when there is a request or when there are calls for India to condemn these actions, and I think India has a very consistent policy as to not criticize Russia, at least not publicly, or not raise these issues publicly. I think we saw the same in Crimea in 2014. I think one thing Americans, and I think Indians will probably do this. We have to remind Americans also. I mean, there are some who are talking about, are kind of batting for more brinksmanship, right? Or advocating that, let's only talk to Russia when, they climb down. I mean, there has been, I think, a 10,000 troop withdrawal yesterday or day before. Although, of course, it doesn't matter in the large scheme of things. There are still 70 to 80,000 troops amassed at the border. But I would say that there are some American commentators who've been talking about, not talking to Russia at all. And I would say that's going to be a mistake, because they shouldn't actually underestimate Russian will. Uh, there's also been this line of argument, and I think this is very important for us because I think it's going to be a good talking point nonetheless, is that those people who say that the only way to get them to stop, and by them I mean Russia, is to get them to the table, right? Negotiate from a position of strength or force them in some way, right? I think that this whole idea of maximum pressure, you hurt them enough that you draw them to the table. I think Americans should realize that they've already done this with Iran and it hasn't worked, and I don't think it will absolutely in any way achieve any of its goals in Russia as well. And I think Iran is a point of the Iran relationship. Has to be something that we have to learn from the whole episode. How the Trump administration under Bolton, etc., how they pressurized the Indians on the energy front, etc., and how, for example, the Biden administration, remember, was talking about restarting negotiation or restarting these talks. I think India has to be very careful that this does not become another Iran. Of course, I'm not. This is not a general go-to-go comparison, but I would say that that's one lesson that we have to, pay heed to. Uh, so if they keep on, persisting on this front, pushing Russia into the corner, this will only actually help Russia, and by the way, it will help Putin, right? So from that front, I think we should concentrate on, as Sir said, that the Turkey angle. Uh, uh, Putin rightly called it, provocative, and again, remember the Turkey-Pakistan relationship is something which has been bothering India, especially recently, and that's something we should probably look at. But overall, I would say that there are going to be calls for drawing India, and condemning and painting the Russians as the Russia and Chinese as one, and comparing it with, see what's Russia, China doing to you. Same is being done to Ukraine. Why don't you come out and condemn it? I think we have to be very careful, and because remember, a lot of people have talked about this, that Quad is not the NATO, or is not NATO, right? So I think it will be good for India to remind others that, exactly, we are not part of NATO. We are in a different part of the world. And yes, there are issues and there are concerns in New Delhi about Russia, China alignment in different parts of the world. We see, for example, the Russian discomfort on Indo-Pacific. They've been very vocal about this, and I think they've sent the message to New Delhi. But I would say that let's not view it from a Western perspective. And personally, I'm not somebody who's a non-alignment enthusiast, but I would say on these issues, I don't think we have to toe the Western line. We don't have to see Russia and China in cahoots with each other, who are iron brothers of sorts, who are doing everything in a very coordinated manner. I don't think that's the case. Not at least not now, not yet. So in that sense, I would say that we should be trading this very carefully and make sure that this is not a repeat of what happened with Iran.
Indeed. I think Sudarshan, you can give your remarks. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. Again, a lot has been said, but I think I might be. I think the first time I might be going a little contrary to the panel. I mean, okay. Here, my broader take is that geopolitical alignments go for a strategic reset every 30, 40 years or so, right? Various things change, and there's a realignment. Now, if you look at the realignment as of even 3 years ago, till the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the rising, U.S.-China conflict, coupled with the Russia-China bonhomie. Now, if you look at that alignment, it was set sometime in the mid 70s, right? Wherein India, because of its own stupid NAM and Panchashil and all that nonsense, I'm sorry, it is what it is. We were left out in the court, right? I think Surya made that point that Pakistan always knew how to extract mileage, concessions, and money from the US as well as the Chinese, as well as pretty much every player. And I think, and the panelists might chuck shoes at me, but I think
Even India, they
even
extracted
India actually,
concessions.
yes. I mean, yeah, we gave them the most favored nation status. I mean, come on, seriously. But I think India is in that position now. I think play our cards right in the next 4 to 5 years, and we could be the next Pakistan in this aspect. And I think that's very vital. And not just Pakistan, because if you look at China, during the just post Mao or just during Mao, they recognized the need that they could not be isolated, and they sent feelers to the U.S. establishment, right? And what did they do? They acted as a bulwark. They acted as a hedge against Russia, Soviet Union back then. Sorry. How did they extract all those concessions? Because they said, hey, you know what, Americans, we will deal with you and we will act as your, let's say, player against Russia, Soviet Union. And it worked. And they extracted technology, they extracted, literally hundreds of billions of FDI over about 20, 25 years. And now they're forging their own independent path. So now if you look at the alignments are changing. And the US and the West, they need a partner in this part of the world. And right now they don't have any. I mean, Pakistan's ruled out. There's increasing conflict with Russia and China. So India, I think, should be non-aligned in certain issues, like the Ukraine one. because Russia is too important an arms supplier. And I think the Modi government going ahead with the S-400 deal is a brilliant, show of independent foreign policy. We didn't bow down to U.S. pressure and said, you know what, you want to sanction us, feel free. We are going to do what is right for us. But at the same time, I think we can act as the pivot against China, because the U.S. always needs a proxy, always needs a front. And my point is why, I mean, India is in a position to leverage those. So it can extract military concessions, it can extract FDI, it can extract technology, and then again forge our own independent path, because that's what so many countries have done, including the Chinese and the Pakistanis. So I think this is a good opportunity. We should, I think, Indian foreign policy makers, I think, recognize that, and we need to actually drift towards the Western alignment on most issues, while keeping the Russians happy, till we are strong enough, till we are at 8, 9, $10 trillion economy.
Just one quick comment here. I mean, I agree with the previous speaker that there are certain I mean, there is so much of geopolitical flux that we can, of course, if the situation arises, be a little bit more flexible. But I would say that especially when it comes to Ukraine, right, when with the current crisis, I think one has to understand that even in Europe or America, there is no consensus as how they will approach it, right? And I think also Americans also have to realize the downsides of what they're trying to do here. I mean, if Moscow's problem with its neighbors are now quickly being translated into problems for the US, right? Uh, then that's a question that they need to ask. How far are they willing to go? And again, one important question I think the United States or people in the United States have to ask themselves, and I think this is something which, in the current discussion, you won't find, it getting too much importance, is whether, I mean, just ask yourself whether the US, left in a better position or a worse position if it doubles down on enlargement today. So if it does indeed double down on enlargement today, uh, what kind of other challenges does it prong up for the Americans? And again, they have to understand that, for example, even if you think or believe that you are treading very mildly or very carefully, as Americans tend to always believe, it is important to understand how this action is perceived in Russia. You can't entirely dismiss their concerns, and I think on this front, India has to be very careful, because it may find itself in a similar position, in the future. So ultimately, even if Moscow understands that Ukraine is not joining in, or let's say is not being invited for now, or that it is not being armed to the teeth, like some Russians, of course, think, or entirely aligned with Europe, EU, etc., it is not unreasonable for Moscow to ask what will happen to Ukraine in the future. And I think that is the question that they're trying to, and that is the answer that they're trying to seek. And there seems to be no clear answers coming from the West. So I, on that front, I would say that uh, we have to be very careful. And I would say that becoming like Pakistan also has its downfalls, as we have seen. I think it depends on which questions and what kind of answers are we looking for.
Great. And I think, as Tateshji rightly pointed out, I think we have to go on discussing about the role of Turkey in the Indo-Pacific in future, maybe, and maybe even Greece and Cyprus. So I would have to conclude, and because of the simple reason that I consider that this discussion has reached its imminent conclusion, meaningful conclusion, and I think the viewers have got a really brief understanding of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. I think a follow up discussion can happen on Turkey. And um, I think Turkey is a very interesting actor, according to my understanding, simply because of whatever they're facing and whatever they're actually interested to face, which is what even Surya pointed out about. So I'm glad that the viewers have been staying so far and watched this 1 hour 30-minute discussion. And I also thank the panelists for their cooperation. And with this, we end the first episode of Global Hint Season 3. We will be coming up with more discussions, maybe even a book discussion, maybe a dialogue. You can recommend us at at the rate iGlobal Podcast on Twitter as to what do you want to discuss. I certainly request that the discussion should not be limited to mere information warfare or Indo-US relations. There's a lot to discuss in geopolitics, so please recommend us more interesting ideas. So with this, I end this episode, and I thank everyone for the cooperation, and also thanks to those who being watched this. Thank you, and Namova.